Allora, buonasera a tutte e a tutti. Diamo inizio
we would like to start
questa presentazione
this webinar
della ricerca
focusing on the study that we believe to be extremely important and particularly topical on inequalities in Europe and the choices that should be made,
compiute soprattutto dal semestre
particularly by the Italian semester after this pandemic that has significantly affected the various political, economic, and social sectors, and on citizens in particular. While making some introductory remarks, I'd like to thank the speakers for being willing to participate in this webinar. There have been some changes. The president of FEPS, Maria João Guidas, will reach us at a later stage because now she is being vaccinated and all of a sudden had to go for this vaccination, and therefore we're certain she will reach at a later stage as soon as the vaccination is over. There was also another problem, namely the ATUC General Secretary Visentini had to be together with us, but due to previous engagement and unforeseen engagement, I would say, could not be present, but we will send him the proceedings and the documents as well as the recording of this webinar. I would also like to greet Honorable Simona Bonafè. Thanks for being together with us. Simona Bonafè is a member of the European Parliament, and she is also Vice President of the Socialists and Democrats group of the European Parliament. She's a politician that is very active at political and social levels. She is particularly active in the field of refund for companies in particular due to this pandemic, and we follow her closely and with great interest because she's a young politician, and therefore we know that she is the right person to make some considerations on this study that I believe is particularly topical and interesting. I would also like to thank Lorenza Antonucci, university professor and researcher and co-author of this study. It was a very demanding task, and we are particularly grateful for the work and the efforts made for completing this study. And then we will have the possibility of having her presenting this study. And I also wish to thank Pierpaolo Bombardieri, the General Secretary of WIL. And she has so many meetings, but is always able to be present in important meetings as this one. So I really wish to thank him. He's a very busy person because he is particularly interested in the field of inequalities. He is putting forward significant proposals to the Italian government, for example. He is the mover of a bill on changes and new development models to better face the specific need of solving these inequalities in Europe. As Fondazione Nenni, we wanted to participate in this study promoted together with FEPS, the European Foundation for Progressive Studies. FEPS carries out very interesting research and studies, and therefore we wanted to contribute to this line of research on this issue that is extremely important for us. We are convinced that the relaunch of Europe should be based on development of social pillar, because it is essential. There has been so much talk about this Europe of bureaucrats, of politicians with an inward-looking attitude, only imposing sanctions, only focusing on accounting rules. So a Europe far from this great plan, the great design of the Europe of peoples. And therefore we are convinced that the issue of inequalities, as well as the creation of an inclusive welfare or an equitable labor market, enhancing skills and professionalism of workers, refusing unfair competition at European level is important. It is said to see companies that delocalize their business activity to go where workers are paid less, where these workers are not defended by unions, whether they have no rights, where they have no say in the matter, where they cannot protest or take collective actions. I mean, delocalization should be allowed because obviously we live in a free and global world, but they must be carried out in a proper way and not just for the purposes of speculating on the low cost of labor in those countries. And therefore, I think that we must find a solution to solve this problem. With specific reference to the European pillars of social rights, I can say that we have particularly appreciated it. It is a positive achievement because it responds to the specific European needs, but we must be careful because it must not be confined only to provide some support to the poor walks of society, because, you know, providing support to poor people is obviously fair, but it is not sufficient to meet the specific requirements of European peoples. We must kindle hope. We must provide certainty of law in some sectors. For example, the middle class that in the past was the pillar, the mainstay of the economy, is now impoverished. So the European Commission must equip itself with tools, adequate instruments to monitor the situation of inequalities, discrimination, to take systematic action on a continuous basis to tackle these issues. We must go well beyond the national selfish attitudes that fuel inequalities and mistrust of citizens vis-à-vis Europe. Today, the debate on the recovery plan seems to be focused only on economic recovery. Well, we agree that economic recovery is essential and fundamental, because if there is no economic recovery, I mean, all problems would be worsened. But if by economic recovery we mean restoring the pre-pandemic economic development model that led to tax evasion, inequalities, we would run the risk of causing social problems with unexpected consequences across Europe. I think that the pandemic must be a turning point, so to say, for a new development model and for a new social model of the European Union. A model that sees the individual, the people at the core, and not finance. And I think that this is right time to build that Europe of peoples that was the initial design of the founding fathers of Europe, such as Monet, Spinelli, Schumann, Adenauer, De Gasperi, and so on and so forth. They all have this great idea, this great design of creating a great Europe of peoples. You know, FEPS, Nenni Foundation, with this study, wanted to provide a contribution to politicians, to social partners, for the choices to be made in order to move forward along the path of integration. We must never lose sight of the reason why some decisions are taken and the policies that should be developed to achieve those goals. I believe that this study and I hope that the pandemic will enable us to go back talking in presence to people, and I hope that there will be the possibility of further outlining these the results of this study. You know, the difficulties of the various European countries should not be passed down onto Europe when governments cannot provide the responses that citizens expect. Politicians say, you know, this is the fault of Europe, but this is a great mistake, and Europe must show that through the participation of through their participation, citizens can help removing these obstacles. Thank you so much for your kind attention. And now I like to give the floor to the researcher in order to outline the results of the study. So I like to give the floor to the director of the Fondazione Nenni, Antonio Tedesco, for continuing with this webinar. Nicole, Antonio, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you to the president of the Nenni Foundation for these introductory remarks. And these remarks provide a lot of food for thought to start this webinar. We should recall that we are live on the YouTube YouTube channel and on the Facebook page of the Nenni Foundation. You can follow the event live in Italian, while on the webpage of FEPS, you can have the version in English. So on these channels, you can also interact with us and possibly put some questions that will put to our speakers. We would like to start this webinar by giving the floor to Professor Antonucci, professor at the Birmingham University. She will present this study, Inequalities in the European Semester. This study has been carried out together with Francesco Corti, and you can consult the results of this study on the website of the Nenni Foundation. Professor Antonucci, you have the floor. Thank you for the invitation. I am Associate Professor of Social Policies. First and foremost, I'd like to share with you my screen with the infographics that we have prepared. It is in English, but it is a sort of summary of this study. So I will follow this outline. As I said, I worked with Francesco Corti. And indeed, it is a study that was started before the COVID pandemic, because, you know, the European semester is an important instrument to change national social policies. And therefore, our interest was to connect the issue of inequalities that is so important at European level to the European semester. Some initiatives were taken as early as 2017. The European Member of Parliament Lopez submitted a study on European semester and inequalities. And then recently with the European Pillar of Social Rights, there is this idea of social policies not only as productive factors, but as a way to reduce inequalities. So the study was started even before the pandemic, and the evidence we have now on the social impact of the pandemic at the time were not evident, but we were already aware that inequalities in Europe was increasing. In our report, we focused on identifying a specific definition of inequality. So we wondered, how can we face inequality with public policies? And so the idea is that public policies should tackle inequalities, focusing on the reduction of the polarization between upper classes and low classes, and the so-called squeezed middle. Because as also Bellissima said, the middle class has seen a reduction of its importance. We can do so directly with distribution means and also through social and tax policies. So we focused on three aspects in particular, three policy areas, so to say. So the attempt to go well beyond poverty and social exclusion. You know, many European public policies in the past focused on poverty and social exclusion. Also shifting from redistribution to services. And this is quite evident in Italy. For example, if you consider the so-called citizens' income, reddito di cittadinanza, with this shift of resources from other areas to services. So the idea of this reddito di cittadinanza was an attempt to try and carry out a redistribution in the field of social policies. But there is another aspect that we have studied, that is the declining quality of work. We were not just focusing on precariousness, precarious contracts in particular, but the problem is also the precariousness of the working conditions. And this is an issue which is of great interest to the middle class, because, as I said, there has been a decline also of the middle class. We also focused on the link existing between macroeconomic policies and social policies. In the European semester, these two areas are two separate silos, and indeed, we try to create and find a link between the economic policies and the social policies, because we know that social policies have an impact on economic policies. But there is not so much debate on the impact of macroeconomic policies on the social policies. And this is the reason why we try to link these two aspects. Thirdly, the issue of taxation, namely the instruments we have, tax facilities, tax expenditures, and so on and so forth, that have an impact also on the middle class. So we focused on progressive taxation, on the taxation of capital. That should not be progressive. We also focused on the concentration of capital as such, because you may easily understand that capital is also a way to transmit wealth through generations, and taxation on consumption has a regressive effect. So in our study, we carried out an analysis of these three areas. Starting with the social policies, we analyzed the recommendations of the European semester in the field of education, labor market, and social protection. And in so doing, together with Francesco, we have identified the type of social policies to tackle inequality, social inclusion, and so on and so forth. We have identified these areas because it was also necessary to find some indicators that had to be found in order to measure poverty. 80% of wealth concentration is in the hands of a very limited amount of people. We also focus in particular on the inequalities of the middle class. There is also a lack of indicators taking into account precariousness in terms of quality of work. So we wanted to rebalance and reconcile work and life, work-life conciliation. All these indicators that are used extensively by researchers to measure the quality of work are not always included in the European semester. And then there is no great interest in the access to services. The second area that we have analyzed is the macroeconomic one, which is related to the meeting of spending requirements and constraints. You know, there is ever more flexibility in terms of sanctions, probably as a result of the COVID pandemic. But what is evident is the lack of social indicators in the procedures for the macroeconomic imbalances. So no indicator on the precariousness of work, on the fragility of families. And there is also a problem of governance, because it is an area not involving the ministers for labor and social affairs. So there is this separation between the economic and social aspects, as I said before. The third area, as I said, is taxation, that is ever more evident and present in the European semester. But sometimes it is not used in a consistent way. So these recommendations are mainly related to the Baltic countries, to the Central European countries, because they have a problematic tax system in terms of redistribution, but there is no massive use of these recommendations. Furthermore, the focus is always on competitiveness, productivity of the system through taxation. But there is no focus on the reduction of inequalities through tax systems and tax tools. And, you know, taxation is an important and direct tool to have an impact on these problems. So we have made some recommendations that you can see in these infographics. First and foremost, we want to include new indicators to capture the declining quality of work. So you can clearly understand that through these indicators, clear indicators that we have included in the report, you can capture the declining quality of work. You can also assess some problems of financial fragility, and you can also have a better measurement of inequality, not just between poor and rich people, but also considering the middle class. And then we also want to have a coordinated approach between the economic aspects and the social aspects in order to have a more balanced approach, including indicators of financial fragility, and involve the social partners such as the unions, but not just in a formal way. We should say that there has been an increasing involvement of unions and social partners within the European semester, but we can do more. And the third recommendation is encouraging progressive taxation, as shown in the country-specific recommendations. So we need to make a consistent use of the recommendations on the progressive taxation, especially in Baltic and Central European countries. So we must extend it to other countries that have the same problems in terms of capital and labor taxation. We want to have a coordinated approach to tax evasion, because as you may easily understand, there is a strong tax dumping in Europe, and this can be solved through the recommendations of the European semester. And then there is also the request for expanding the tax base in new areas, for example, in the environmental sector, that led to a lot of protests in France. There is the possibility of expanding the tax base, but we must also consider the distribution effects and new forms of taxation may have on the middle class or the low class. This is a sort of summary of the study, and I am available to answer your questions, if any. Thank you.
Bene, grazie alla professoressa.
Thank you, Professor Antonucci, for the interesting summary of the results of the study. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Honorable Simona Bonafè, Vice President of the Socialist and Democrats Group in the European Parliament, for some comments on the study and its results, as well as talking about the initiatives that politicians may take to monitor and better face the issue of economic and social inequalities in Europe. Honorable Bonafè, you have the floor. Thank you for the invitation extended to me. Thanks to the Nenni Foundation. Thanks to the President Romano Bellissima for his food for thought. Because indeed we know that politicians should provide solutions to these issues. I believe that today we are faced with a health emergency with tragic implications. We do not know how we can solve these problems, and therefore our priority is to face this tragic emergency, which is the real war, so to say, for our generation, with all the problems that we may have in the field of vaccination and some choices made by Europe in the vaccination campaign, but this is not the focus of today's discussion. So I must say that very often we will have to face not only the health emergency, but also the economic emergency. And indeed, we know that in Italy, we already had problems in this respect. We have seen, for example, some demonstrations in recent days. So I think that from a certain viewpoint, our priority as ruling class is to tackle the economic problems, and we have a responsibility to shoulder. We must try to charter the course of the post-pandemic situation for the country. I fully share what Bellissima said. We cannot think that after the pandemic we can go back to the business as usual, because that model was not working even before the pandemic. And Bellissima rightly underlined the economic model that has characterized Europe so far has increased social inequalities. And then we can also say that it was a model that reduced growth in Europe, and this growth was not friendly to the environment. So it was a model that produced inequality and was not sustainable from the environmental viewpoint. So the new model that we need to define should provide responses to the three great revolutions that we have to face. The environmental revolution, because we are in the midst of problems connected with climate change. We also have to face a digital transition, as well as what I define the equity revolution. As to the digital transition, I think that this pandemic has stepped up some processes which were already underway. And with respect to the digital transition, our system was already under stress. And indeed, the pandemic exposed the shortcomings we had in terms of infrastructures. Today, we have large areas in Italy and in Europe that are not connected with the internet. And this has been clearly shown because we have the need, for example, of distance learning in schools due to this pandemic. And this is a problem that we need to face. Digital infrastructure is essential, and we need to make progress in this respect. So these are the three great revolutions green revolution, digital transition, and the equity revolution that should be the pillars of the competitivity of this system. And when I talk about social cohesion, I believe that this is also a problem of competitiveness. There is no doubt that the most dynamic societies are those with a higher level of social cohesion. So we must tackle the issue of inequalities very seriously. So what are the tools in order to do so? As European Member of Parliament and Vice President of the Socialists and Democrats group, I've always analyzed the situation, and I also wish to thank Professor Antonucci for this interesting study and the indicators of the European semester. I must admit that today Europe has an historic instrument available, that is the Next Generation EU. And you can easily understand what the direction is, namely creating the conditions for growth. And this growth must be resilient and must be favorable, friendly to next generations, because obviously if we fail with this instrument, we condemn to a terrible decline our next generations. So this is a tool, an instrument that we must use very carefully and very skillfully, for the additional reason that having an instrument based on common indebtedness was not easy and could not be taken for granted, because, you know, Next Generation EU is partly based on common debt to make these resources available to Europe. And part of this common indebtedness, to pay part of these resources, Europe is wondering about the increase in EU own resources. You may know that Europe is mainly funded by the EU member states, and only a small part is provided by EU own resources. And I'm talking about these EU own resources because especially the right-wing parties in Europe made the message that these own resources are new taxes for citizens, whereas we must convey a different message to the citizens. Citizens should understand that this is a formidable means for providing resources that cannot find within national governments anymore. For example, tax on carbon. We know that we suffer the unfair competition of the countries that do not follow the same behaviors at environmental level. This carbon tax can contribute to common indebtedness, but there is another tax, the tax on the so-called big data, the digital tax, as we may call it. All these taxes defy national borders, because we all know that these big societies often take advantage of favorable taxation that can be found in some European countries. So I believe that we must insist on creating a more equitable system. Obviously, Next Generation EU also identifies some specific targets. For example, 37% for projects focused on green transition and 20% for projects on digital transition. But it is an instrument that wants to remedy these inequalities within the system. Clearly, we are in a position to make a paradigm shift within Europe, working on the assumption that we must improve the quantity and the quality of this growth. And this is the reason why I think that after the pandemic, we can no longer go back to the business as usual, to the austerity measures that contributed to an increase in inequalities. And so there is an intense debate within the European Parliament on how to change the macroeconomic framework. You may know that today we have this escape clause on the Stability Pact until 2022. This clause can be frozen until 2022, but this is not enough. And before that deadline, we must also change the governance policies, starting from the European semester that has now become a system for monitoring and correcting macroeconomic imbalances in our systems. And I believe that your study can provide some food for thought that we must consider. Once again, we're not starting from scratch because we had a strategy of annual growth of 2021 with new criteria within the European semester, but clearly the social pillar must become one of the core elements of this semester. In few weeks, we will have an important initiative in Porto, and I believe that this will be an opportunity to discuss on how to face these inequalities concretely, tangibly. I think that we must also focus on new skills. And I also believe that it is this right time for this debate, for this discussion, to remain not just limited discussions among experts, but rather more open discussions, also thanks to the stimuli provided by your studies. Together with the Council, we must be able to implement a change that can create conditions of social equality. Otherwise, we will remain within a system that would be completely unsustainable after the impact of the pandemic. So once again, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Professor Antonucci for this study that will certainly provide interesting food for thought to discuss other issues, also public debt, because we have started to understand that the public debt can be no longer be measured only on parameters, but must be sustainable. And you know, sustainability is based also on the qualitative growth instruments that we can define. So we have a great responsibility to shoulder. We cannot shy away from this responsibility, and we can try all together to charter a new course for the future. Thank you. Thank you to Honorable Simona Bonafè for her contribution. President Rodriguez is still waiting for the vaccination. But anyway, as already said in the introduction of the president of the Nenni Foundation, Romano Bellissima, Will is particularly committed to this issue, and in this phase of significant social crisis. So to say, we are trying to do so as well as union to face this problem, because this is extremely important in the current pandemic situation. So now I'd like to give the floor to the General Secretary of WIL, Pierpaolo Bombardieri. First and foremost, I wish to thank you for the invitation. I wish to thank Antonio, Romano, Professor Antonucci for the study, and Simona Bonafè, that has always been working on these European issues. May I try to extend the scope of this discussion? Following up what you said so far and the results of this study, I'd like to raise some issues, and I hope that over the next few weeks we will have the opportunity of further analyzing these issues. What is the idea of Europe that we have? When I think to Europe, I think to the Europe of peoples, to the Europe of solidarity that enabled over the last few years to travel throughout Europe thanks to Erasmus. Thinking that obviously you can travel to Paris or to Berlin as you could move, for example, through capital cities in our countries. So how have we experienced the management of Europe? So I would like to say something following up what was said by Romano Bellissimo or by Simona Bonafè. But we start from these aspects. We must try to understand what is the Europe that we want to achieve, the geopolitical Europe faced with a division into blocks that is increasing. We need to define new equilibria. And indeed, we should understand how the management of vaccination is now an issue of geopolitics, and how the European continent is facing these new scenarios. You know, Europe and also the Mediterranean region, and this is particularly important for us in Italy. So we are faced with another continent where the management of vaccination will be again a geopolitical issue. So what is our idea of Europe? A Europe based on solidarity for European citizens, because it is again on the principle of solidarity that we must charter our course. Obviously, we must consider the situation that we have, for example, in Eastern European countries, or the situation we have in Africa, for example. There is this principle of solidarity that should be at the basis for our Europe. So if we rethink these aspects, we should start from here, from the idea we have of Europe in the near future. Solidarity-based Europe, a Europe based on respect for workers, for elderly people, that shares some principles of youth cultural growth. Because as you said, the inequalities we had in Italy, especially in recent time, we have these inequalities, these differences between the north and the south in Italy, between the elderly people and the young people. but there is also a difference between the north and the south of Europe. So the difference is no longer between Milan, let's say, or Palermo in the southern part of Italy, but between Berlin and Rome. And you know, there is an inequality in the field of services and social infrastructure. And this is of fundamental importance to reduce the inequalities that force women to remain at the sidelines of the labor market. Because obviously, if we do not talk about social infrastructure and social support, especially to women, in order to ensure their participation in the labor market, we cannot solve these inequalities. And so I believe that in so doing, we have to clarify the idea of Europe that we want to achieve. We should do this in Italy, obviously, but this is particularly difficult for the party and political divisions. And we should try and discuss the idea of Europe that we want to achieve in the future. And we must involve our neighboring countries, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal. So I believe that we have a long way to go with respect to the vision of Europe that we want to have. In the near future, we will have the conference on the future of Europe. But I want to say that the risk that we run is to have just structural adjustments, but cannot be systematic, consistent. So I believe that today's discussion should also identify the contribution that we can provide within our sphere of activity. We as unionists, Simona as politician, I mean, we need to have a common discussion to identify noble and common ideals for Europe. And then choices will follow. The change of the European semester should be linked to an idea of Europe going well beyond the Stability Pact, the austerity measures, the austerity policies. We are following what Commissioner Gentiloni is doing in Europe to finally overcome the Stability Pact. We know that it is not easy for Commissioner Gentiloni to do so, because there are also other commissioners with whom he has to come to terms. But you know, our goal is to overcome the Stability Pact. And why? So a few days ago, I discussed with Cottarelli, and he told me I was right. But you know, the discussions that we are doing may also help experts to change their mind. If we have a common idea of Europe, solidarity-based Europe, a Europe that can fight against inequality, injustice, the consequences that we may draw is that we must be consistent with our actions to reach this goal. So this is just a starting point, as Simona said. Either we succeed in reaching, for example, the possibility of having European bonds, European funds that can structure European finance, or the fact of having this great investment, Next Generation EU, remains a very limited instrument, so to say. So a piecemeal measure that will certainly not achieve all the necessary goals. So I believe that choosing to overcome the Stability Pact and making this Next Generation EU a stable, a permanent instrument, the possibility of having Eurobonds and funding that can enable EU to carry out these projects. And in order to do so, we have identified some ideas as unions. There are some structural aspects to be considered in this Europe, which is characterized by inequalities. Is it tolerable to have tax havens? Because this is another important struggle that we have to wage. And we realize that this is a problem also in the labor market. But we know that there are so many large companies operating in Italy and pay taxes in another European countries that is a tax haven. And this is a problem, a structural problem affecting all of us. Because if in Europe we have countries that believe they are smarter than others, this is not good. So there is the problem of tackling the problem of taxation. And this is not just a European problem, but it is a global problem. Over the last few days, it has been clearly stated by the free traders that explain that there is an invisible hand that regulates the market. Now realize that it is necessary to have a sort of minimum taxation for all companies operating at world level. This was stated by the International Monetary Fund. This was stated by many liberals, by many financial institutions. And so this is an issue that we must tackle because this regards Europe. I'm referring obviously to overcoming tax havens because this is a problem also at competition level. Simona mentioned that we have large companies operating on the web that pay no taxes. They have large profit and redistribute this profit among their shareholders without paying taxes. So if even in the United States are aware of this, if in the UK they are aware of this, and even the International Monetary Fund is aware of this, probably we should urge our European institutions and our Prime Minister to do something in this respect. Clearly, there are some values that are important for us. For example, we launched this idea of an extra tax on the extra profit. And when we submitted it, we feared a harsher reaction, while indeed we realize that there are some politicians that agree on this. And I hope that also Simona can support this proposal of ours. We follow the voting also on some specific measures at European Parliament level. And there is a Belgian association that has provided useful information to us regarding the votes cast by the various politicians and the various political parties on tax measures. And indeed, in Italy, we have some difficulties because there were no newspapers and magazines ready to publish this information. Today, taxing extra profits with an additional tax, with an extra tax, only for those companies or large multinationals that record huge profits in this period, especially for the business and the activities related to the pandemic, I think is fair. I think that it is fair in view of a redistribution of this profit, because there should be a redistribution between those who have earned a lot of money to people that are really undergoing great difficulties to survive. And you know, now in Italy, for example, we have people with open-ended contracts that are far better than people with fixed-term contracts, with freelance professionals that are now undergoing debt crisis. And you know, also the public debt must be understood in terms of structural components, and I believe that we should do this not just in Italy but also in Europe with respect to this extra tax on extra profits. We should understand that this may change the fate of Europe when we will start again our ordinary life. We should identify goals to be reached no longer through free trade or austerity policies. We need a paradigm shift. There are those who believe that, for example, the debt may be reduced through investment. And we believe that this is right, because we believe that through growth, through investment, inequalities, debt can be reduced, because we do not want to leave people behind. These are the issues that we would like to face. And obviously, these are issues that pertain to our story as unionists, because obviously we made a personal choice because we wanted to provide support to those who are left behind. Then there is another aspect that I want to tackle, namely the labor market. You know, there is a debate in Europe on how to consider the development and the protection of work. There is much talk about minimum income, for example. I think that first and foremost, we must put an end to the excessive power of the multinationals. As Romano said, we need to have the possibility to be representative and put an end to the excessive power of the multinationals. I insist on this as a reformer. I cannot accept that the investment made in great multinationals to have vaccines are not matched by transparency in contracts. Why cannot we have a copy of the contracts that Europe has signed with these big pharma multinationals? I do not want to apportion the blame. I do not want to enter into the details why a vaccine costs more than another. But let us think that at the end of the Second World War, there was an ideological division among countries. But, you know, the division of the world in spheres of influences was based on ideas, on ideologies, I would say. Today, we run the risk of dividing the world in zones of influence based on an economic power that we cannot even identify. And I hope that this will no longer be the case. There is no discussion about these issues, not even in our talk shows, at least in Italy. Probably the situation in another country is different. We should go back to these ideas that are at the core of our activity. So what is the idea that we have in terms of labor market rights? Is the contract something to be reached and defended, or that the minimum wage can solve all problems? And this is not true. There is another basic choice to be made. If we consider that a contract, a set of rules, can help workers to claim rights, that's okay. But if we think that there is a market system in which the minimum income is decided autonomously by governments, I think that we are far from that idea of solidarity-based Europe that we all, I hope, want to achieve. Obviously, I'm just providing some food for thought. I have no pre-ordered solutions, but I think that we should base our activity on great ideas, We have to share ideas, values, and we should try to do this together. And in our daily activity, in our daily work as unionists, as professors, as politicians, we should convince as many people as possible that another idea of development is possible, that another idea of Europe, of Italy, is possible. And we should fight with greater determination. Thank to the General Secretary of WIL, Pierpaolo Bombardieri. Now I'd like to give the floor to the President of the Foundation Pietro Nenni, Romano Bellissima, if he wants to add something else. I am really satisfied with this initiative because a lot of food for thought has been provided to this discussion. You know, I know Simona Bonafè, so I couldn't expect nothing else of what she said. Pierpaolo Bombardieri, as I said, is a unionist that is playing his role in a completely different way compared to the past, because he is trying to make important choices and is doing so every day, conveying messages on TV, in talk shows, following the suggestions provided by union members and so on and so forth. He is a very generous person. And I think that it will certainly be successful. I hope that there will be further opportunities to tackle these issues. And I've seen that a lot of people have been following our webinar and our discussion. And this is a source of great enthusiasm for me, because I think that these ideas must be further spread. We must convey these messages. Unfortunately, some people could not attend the webinar, but you know, this may happen. But I can say that also the presentation of the results of this study by Professor Antonucci has been particularly interesting. The Nenni Foundation will continue to interpret not only the story of those who came before us, but the way in which we can contribute to build a new Europe along the lines of the initial aims and design of the founding fathers of the European Union. Clearly, these choices must be reaffirmed. We can no longer have just a Europe of finance, a Europe where citizens cannot recognize themselves. As I said, and I insist on this, we need to create a Europe of peoples, the Europe that raised so much enthusiasm at the time. And Pierpaolo mentioned the principles on which we have to work. Thank you so much for your kind participation, and thank you so much, and let us see in another initiative organized by our foundation. Thank you. Thank you.